Welcome to Everything Comes Together. My name is Sreenag and I'm an architectural photographer based in Chennai, India. On this series, I speak with people in the architecture, photography and design communities about their personal journeys. But today's interview is a part of Project Spotlight. On Project Spotlight, I'll be interviewing the architects and designers behind some of the unique projects I get to shoot. We will talk about the design process behind the project, their design choices and intent, how they solve problems, and basically what makes this project particularly special. In December 2023, I got to photograph the completely unique Terminal 2 at the Kempegowda International Airport in Bangalore, India. This building was designed as a terminal in the garden, and it really lived up to its title. I had been waiting to work with a specialist landscape architect, so when the opportunity came my way, I made the most of it. My introduction to the project came from my guest today, Andrew Haines. Andrew is a landscape architect and senior associate at the UK-based Grant Associates. As T2 is a fully operational airport and as neither Andrew nor I are based in Bangalore, we spent hours in conversation as he walked me through the finer details of the design, materials, and intent. After getting such a clear idea about the project from Andrew, I thought this would be the perfect project to launch the Project Spotlight series. Today, we will talk about how Grant Associates landed the project, how they went about designing the landscape for a project on a different continent, and how they want a passenger to feel as they walk through Terminal 2. And just before we get to the interview, a quick disclaimer. While Grant Associates had hired us to photograph Terminal 2, we were not paid or commissioned in any way to produce this interview. This episode is a self-funded production as part of our ongoing series, Everything Comes Together. The complete creative and editorial control over this interview rests with us. Now, here's my conversation with Andrew Haines.
Well, I suppose you've got to rewind back to a time when we were working on Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. And after we completed that, a number of the client team were lucky enough to see it, either individuals travelling over there with their families for vacation. Some were over there for business, but there was a group from the client team that saw Gardens by the Bay, in particular the vice president of the landscape team, but also the CEO himself had seen Gardens by the Bay. And I think that started to generate a conversation about landscape architects, and who might be best placed to take on, such an amazing opportunity that existed at Kempegowda. We'd already done some work for BIL as part of the wider master plan in 2013. And the plans that they had in place for the kind of broader expansion of the airport, as I understand it, was to focus on a new terminal as part of that master plan. So again, I think those kind of combined, those two combined things, so actually seeing us and our work at Gardens by the Bay as a completed project, and just seeing the kind of innovation that we delivered there, but also the fact that they'd seen, I suppose, almost on a test project, the master planning work that we'd done on in 2013. We were well placed then to have a conversation around T2. So we're sort of then fast forwarding from 2013 to about 2016, 2017, when we were interviewed for the project, and my director Andrew Grant flew to Bangalore for that interview and conversations. And at the same time, the architects were being interviewed as part of a competition for the design of the building. But one key aspect of the brief and for appointing us was to create a building that sat within a landscape. And the vision for that BIL had was a terminal in a garden. And that was the starting point, really. And from that point, and from us being successfully appointed to work on the project, we were then introduced to the successful architect, SOM, who based in New York. And from that, a kind of initial kind of meeting, we then sort of grew the team, grew the design team. And that first meeting was over here in Bangalore, which was a fascinating sort of week-long kind of charrette or workshop, where the various design heads came together with the client team and really just talked openly about the brief and the vision and how perhaps to bring that to fruition. So we bounced around lots and lots of ideas, and we kind of slept, ate, drank the project for a week, and really immersed ourselves in everything Bangalore. And that was really the start of this long journey of 5-6 years to the fruition that you see on site today, of the terminal on site. And from that have grown other projects. We're also involved with the kind of broader site, the MMTH, that will eventually sit in the front of Terminal 2, which is a multimodal transport hub that will come with a range of retail and other benefits, which include significant lagoon areas.
Landscape architecture in India is, you don't really see too many specialist landscape architecture firms in India. Is it any different in the UK, or are they a lot more common there?
Landscape architecture as a profession is very well established in the UK. It goes back to a time of Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. So there's a real established profession in the UK. I think in India, I think you're right. I wouldn't say it's in its infancy. There are many courses that now teach landscape architecture, and within our office we have individuals that have trained and also worked within India and now working in our practice. So I think it's a healthy profession that's growing and growing.
No, the reason I was asking you is, well, that is today, right? Today you have people from India who have that exposure to landscape. But when you started working on the project in 2013, I assume it was a bit more nascent than what it is today. So when you were working with people here, were there certain steps that you needed to go through to bring them onto the same page as you were? I mean, creatively, were you guys aligned?
It's a very interesting question, and I think in terms of the vision, I think the client was light years ahead of what they wanted to deliver with this particular project, and certainly the 4 pillars that sat under the vision of creating a terminal in the garden really kind of set the pace for the project, and you could see the ambition there.
Yeah, and what were the 4 pillars?
The 4 pillars were terminal in a garden, sustainability, technology, and also arts and culture. Terminal in a garden really embracing biodiversity, planting, and plant design. But I suppose that set the tone for the vision. But of course there was a lot of detail to get through, and of course we came at this project with a lot of kind of creativeness, a lot of innovation, but also a lot of technical ability and technical experience as well. The client also had the foresight to appoint a lot of very experienced other consultants, like the architects, a number of engineering companies as well, and also companies that were very much experienced at building and delivering airports, whether it's the infrastructure or whether it's the technology that goes into the kind of operation side. So we knew we had a good, experienced team. But I think, going back to your point, there was a huge learning curve. I mean, there was a learning curve for us, working on an airport and working with other specialisms that we'd not worked with before.
How many airports have you worked on?
So we've worked. This was our first, and we've worked on a couple, but this was our first. But I think what attracted us to this project was the fact that it was delivering a terminal building within a landscape, as opposed to a landscape around a terminal building. So the extent of the landscape and the extent of the ambition was really attractive. And actually trying to create a setting for the airport, not simply beautifying the airport, but a hard-working landscape that was going to, offer, passive cooling, was going to offer a sustainable water system, and also offer up the opportunity to increase the amount of biodiversity, both locally within the confines of the airport, but also that knock-on effect to the wider context beyond the boundaries of the airport.
From walking around the airport and photographing it for the past couple of days, it's of course extremely unique. Unique not just in terms of design, but in terms of concept. We talked a lot about the forest belt, which was the highlight I was looking forward to the most before I saw it in person, and it's extremely impressive. I know that you spent a lot of time going around the country, picking the right kinds of plants and trees that had to go in there. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose certain plants, why you chose certain trees, and what were you trying to achieve with the forest belt?
Well, again, in order to, I suppose, answer that question, first of all, I think we've got to kind of frame the concept. So I think stepping back to how we came up with that design. And that was really, we went through lots and lots of optioneering about the shape of the terminal. So that was connected very much about people flow and passenger flow, what they call PAX flow. So there was a lot of kind of connectivity and operational things that we had to think about very, very early on in the process. But we also wanted to free our minds and think very creatively about what we were trying to achieve here from a landscape perspective. And always rewinding back to that vision, creating a terminal within a garden. So what we tried to do, in effect, you have a pavilion, a very large pavilion, and we wanted to set that within a landscape setting. And we wanted to really test just how big a landscape setting we could achieve. And of course, with such a large building as an airport terminal, that's got to be pretty big as well.
Substantial.
So our first offering, our first idea, was to sit this pavilion with a series of connecting bridges that connect into the piers that allow you onto your plane within this substantial belt of planting. At the same time, we were also fascinated by the broader context of the Karnataka landscape, the rocky outcrops, the little kind of sort of planting hillocks that sit within that landscape, and also the broad kind of water story that exists within the Karnataka landscape. So we looked at all these kind of aspects alongside developing a framework around the terminal itself. And the other factor was we had this very wide, what we came to term the forest belt. We also had the need to apply a kind of topography that would benefit those that were arriving at the lower level and those that were departing. So all airports kind of work on that system of obviously of arriving and departing passengers, and they're separated. So again, we did a lot of optioneering with the client and the architects as to how that might work. But ostensibly, it was a building that sat within this landscape frame, and that landscape frame became the forest belt. And we wanted that forest belt to be all-consuming around that building. So when people either arrived or were departing, would have to physically cross that forest belt. And as the design kind of developed, that also opened up opportunities, as you would have seen from the terminal, with regards to these pavilions that sit within the forest belt and are offering up other opportunities and physical access through walkways to get people even closer to nature and get people closer to those treetops. So that kind of set the tone for the frame of the building from a landscape perspective. But we were also incredibly interested in this idea of a journey. So from a client's point of view, the journey of a passenger starts at home when they're booking the flight, and that idea of them making their way to the airport. So we had this kind of fascinating discussion with the client and the architects about how passengers will arrive, and also thinking about the pulse of a passenger and the pulse of a particular passenger. So if you're going on business, that pulse may be a bit quicker. If you are going on vacation, then that pulse might be a little bit slower, little blips along the route. So we were thinking about all these different profiles of passengers and how they might use the terminal, both those that were arriving and those that were departing, across the two levels. So another factor inside the building was therefore trying to establish a series of gardens along that journey. And we wanted this idea that a passenger moved through the terminal in a very particular way, and that way was always in contact with gardens or nature. That might be a simple planter at ground level. It might be what became the vales and the bells at roof level. It may be vertical surfaces, or it may be simple planters that kind of punctuated the journey through the terminal. But the idea was to create some very specific garden spaces that you move through. So as you would have seen at departures, you move through these brick portals that are all planted. So that was your sort of first garden experience. And then at departures or at arrivals, we always, anticipated having a series of gardens, and they became what we call the slot gardens. And those have that connection between departures and arrivals. So you're always in contact with planting. The other fun aspect is this connection between arrivals and departures. So we wanted to play this game of departing passengers being able to see arriving passengers. And obviously there's a level of physical separation, but we wanted those view corridors to work. And that starts with the slot gardens. For those departing, we'll be able to look down and see those arriving.
The one thing I noticed as someone who's photographing the building is the level of depth that is there from across the building, right? So at the departures, there are the international passengers enter through one set of gates and the domestic through another. But once they get in there, it's just one huge space, and the space is full of different kinds of hanging planter systems. Is there any particular reason you chose certain planters or certain plants for each, for domestic or international?
Sure, and I think, again, it's a great question because we spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about the planting strategy and the concept about the plants inside the terminal versus those outside. Those outside tend to focus on the native, in some parts the endemic, but very much the native, and really focusing on the western and the eastern cats as well within the forest belt. Internally, the environmental conditions are slightly different. They're quite unique. So we had to select a palette of plants that were going to survive, thrive and establish well, both at ground level but also at roof level. The reason for having the planting mainly at roof level, as you see through the structures that we've got hanging, both the bells and the vales, that was due to the fact that with these PAX flows, the client wanted to optimize space within the ground level. At the end of the day, airports are about processing people to get from A to B. And what we were trying to do was to introduce gardens inside the building that were going to allow the passengers still to move through the building freely and allow opportunities to pause and relax as well at certain points of that journey. But we had to respect the fact that this was about processing people's passports to move through check-in, through security and beyond. So we had to think very carefully, both for international and domestic, about that journey. So the aerial planting was to free up space at the check-in area, at the ground level. We had a series of planters that echo the same shape above with the bells. Right. So that was a very deliberate design solution to a problem that we had, but it also freed up space for circular concessions that sit within there. So the design language really does create that flow at ground level. Now, domestic and international follow the same kind of routes through to the orientation garden. Now, the orientation garden sits within that midpoint beyond security, but before you get into your kind of retail world and beyond getting to your gates. And that was always seen as a multi-level space. Again, the opportunity for departing passengers to see arriving passengers coming below. And we did that through a trick of using these enormous laterite walls, so using a very local traditional material to create these curvaceous walls within the orientation garden, which also enabled us to connect departing and arriving levels. In terms of the planting has a very similar feel within. We wanted to keep a continuity within the check-in space. We didn't want to create one sort of planting for domestic passengers and another sort of planting strategy for the international passengers. But what we tried to do internally, and this was partly due to the environmental conditions, was to select plants that gave a slightly kind of broader worldview of the species that we were selecting. That was also driven, as I say, because we had slightly drier conditions internally. The temperatures are obviously different internally to externally. So it does have a slightly more sort of Mediterranean feel. There's a band that you could draw around the globe. So it did have a kind of Mediterranean, there's kind of South American plants in there. There's also South Asian plants that sit within that orientation garden.
And then an entire set of cacti.
Absolutely. So the cacti and some of the other plants that have these very unique, almost extreme sort of silhouettes was a deliberate concept, in that we knew that a large proportion of the passengers would be travelling at times of darkness, when the forest belt isn't visible. So we wanted to really make a spectacle of the planting inside the terminal. Now, perhaps we'll come on to the bells and veils in a moment, but the orientation garden was always about silhouetting plants against these amazing laterite walls. And the lighting scheme was very much about throwing shadow back against the walls and creating a real drama and creating a dynamism that you see right the way back from your journey from check-in through to the orientation garden themselves. And of course, the orientation garden is also a point where you come through security. Perhaps you've got to put your belt back on or your shoes and gather your belongings. So it was also a point where we created quite deliberate organic shapes where people could perch and sit and just take a breath and decompress before continuing their journey through to retail, where there's another set of gardens that begin to come into play.
When you speak of the spectacle that you want people to see when you walk in, especially for both passengers, domestic and international, is the sunken gardens. So that is, when you told me about it early on, a few months ago, I could only imagine what it would look like, but it was seriously impressive. Unfortunately, we couldn't go down into the gardens to, experience it in a way that no one else could. But we did experience it just as any other passenger would. And it was something that it's very rare that in an airport, like you said, two sets of passengers can experience the same thing. And that was another space where international arrival passengers could look up at the international departure passengers as well in the upper level. So what was the motivation behind doing something as elaborate as the sunken gardens, apart from the fact that it is a spectacle?
Well, thank you. It was a real challenge, but I think, again, picking up on the theme of wanting to create this journey through a series of gardens, as I said, sort of picking up from the orientation garden, you move through a series of retail spaces. Now, obviously, if you're an international passenger, you move through duty free, and if you're a domestic passenger, you're moving through, other types of retail and F&B as well. But the desire and I think the concept was to really try and keep those gardens going. And you would have noticed the aerial gardens, the bells, follow the journey through.
Sort of guide you through.
They guide you through, and they continue through into, as you would have seen, through beyond the orientation garden, and they reappear within that retail space. So they are your sort of guiding light, as it were. And some of those are planted, most of them are planted, some of them are digital, advertising bells, and some are lit. So the idea was that aerial spectacle continues, and there are other digital aspects that have been introduced to kind of guide you through. There's also garden moments. The idea was we would establish these planting garden moments as you went through retail. So we didn't want it to be just a bland experience of shopping, wall to wall, with some very simple seating in between. We wanted the ability to continue that garden story through. And then that kind of brings you on the international side into the sort of main retail kind of hub, where you have traditionally a lot of food and beverage set with, around usually seating. But we really wanted to create this centerpiece, this sunken garden. And the reason for creating a sunken garden was twofold, really. We wanted to invite that spectacle, as you say, for arriving passengers, coming through at the lower level, but also departing passengers with a series of bridges that cross over it. So you have that photographic moment. And as we saw when we walked around the terminal, it's really used for that purpose. And I think people are surprised to see this incredible garden that sort of is sunken, but it comes up and spills over around the edges. It's also about, again, it's going back to passenger flow. We were challenged with the space that we had available, both within the retail zone, but obviously there's a lot of complex operations going on below. You've got the baggage, obviously the baggage hall beneath there. So there was a lot to fit in. So the idea of creating a sunken garden was to optimize the space, because we could use the vertical faces and the terracing to get as much planting in as possible, and really get as much sort of impact from a smaller space. The other great thing is you can experience it both within the retail space at departure level, you can experience it at arrival level, but also within departures you have the mezzanine levels, restaurants that sit up above, through this kind of planting kind of edge that they've established around that upper mezzanine. You then look through that down into the sunken garden as well. So again, you're allowing every type of passenger and every type of passenger experience to enjoy that central garden. So it's working incredibly hard. And of course it's got, the plants were chosen to operate at their optimum, both within the environmental conditions and the lighting levels that you have within departure, as well as those slightly darker levels that sit down at arrivals. So you have that sort of passage of plants, those different plants that do better within shade and within in greater light levels. And of course we also wanted to introduce noise through water. And as you would have experienced walking around yesterday, that wonderful sound of water, whether you're at the upper level or the lower level, you can hear that noise, and it just creates a wonderful kind of background.
And it just grabs people's attention right away, and you cannot but help to go and see what's happening there. And especially on the upper level, when you walk up to a hole in the ground, essentially, is that you look down and then you see a stepped garden all the way down, and you don't expect a waterfall inside a building on that scale. You've obviously done a lot of really exciting things within this airport. Were there any designs that you really wanted to do but weren't able to execute, or it wasn't practical, or there was something that you really wanted to do but you weren't able to actually do it?
Again, that's a really interesting question, because obviously at the start of any project, and this was no different, you spend a lot of time working through the brief, perhaps redefining the brief, but also always with that vision in mind. And with such a complex building as an airport, you are always going to be faced with many challenges. And I think in the early part of the process, the plans were hugely ambitious. You know, we had water on every face, we had planting on every face, every surface was green, because we were following that vision to create a terminal within the garden and trying to fit a great deal of planting, both around the pavilion, the terminal pavilion, but also within it. And as the project develops, you realise that actually there's a lot of other things that need to happen within an airport terminal. And we worked collaboratively with the architects and the engineers and the client to refine that brief and to refine that journey of gardens. Of course, I think there's always probably a question mark whether we could have squeezed more planting into the terminal. But I think it's really hit that sweet spot. And I think actually in hindsight, what it did do was make us work, you know, far harder into coming up with far more innovative ideas about how we could accommodate planting within, you know, such a process-driven space or building. And that's really where the bells, the idea of the bells and the veils, of actually incorporating those at an aerial level. And they work so hard for the terminal, both as that guiding light, as it were, through check-in and through the orientation garden and beyond to the retail world, that perhaps we wouldn't have come up with such an amazing concept if we hadn't been challenged with the idea that not all the planting could be squeezed onto the ground plane, either at arrivals or at departures. So I think actually in hindsight that kind of drove a much more exciting design. And it's a design that has taken off. I mean, it's in many magazines now. It's Instagram heavy, passengers coming through. You saw people's jaws dropped as they came through to check in, and just seeing the spectacle of the aerial gardens, sat alongside, you know, the wonderful kind of forest belt just outside the windows. So again, it's this play of inside and outside as well, that works so well. So I think in terms of, I certainly don't think regret comes into it. I think we were actually very pleased with that additional challenge, because I think what we've come up with is something wholly unique.
And you're visiting the airport today after almost 4 years.
Yes.
Because of COVID.
Exactly. You know, I've lived and breathed this project really since the master plan in 2013, but really the terminal from 2017 to now has been a tremendously rewarding journey. But of course that was broken by the awful, you know, global pandemic, and that set a whole series of new challenges, less so for us, but more so for the client and the contractors on site. And, you know, they have worked extremely hard in very challenging circumstances to get the project, you know, through that period and still kind of deliver such an incredible project. And a project relates incredibly closely to the original concepts that we came up with and the detailed designs that we developed alongside our client, BIL. And also, you know, SOM, the architects too. So coming back after, you know, 3, almost 4 years has been incredibly special, and incredibly rewarding actually, to spend time in the terminal, spending time with the landscape and horticultural teams that have helped deliver the vision on site. Has been incredibly rewarding. I mean, we're very fortunate to have a client that is an incredible custodian for both the master plan, but in particular T2, and driving that forward, both to establish the scheme, establish the planting, but you saw the amount of care and attention that goes into the planting now. It's on
that's
site.
what I wanted to come to. So most of the people who watch these interviews will be architects, and they would know, as everyone could see when you enter the terminal, that there are thousands and thousands of plants all over the place, whether they're hanging from the ceiling, or they're on the green walls, or they're on the ground level, or they're in the forest belt, and they're all around the terminal building itself. And we could see that there was constant maintenance. The landscape team seems to be close to 500 people who work on keeping the airport in great shape, the plants in the airport in great shape. And you talked about sustainability, right? So how do you handle the water consumption for the plants, and how sustainable is that?
Again, in this day and age, it's a crucial question,
Yes.
and it's one that we again were challenged with as we were developing the plans for the terminal. And to put it into context, I mean, there's over 600,000 individual plants and trees in and around the terminal. I think there's over 3,500 native species,
Right.
and I think nearly 700 endemic species as well. So it was a project that, again, working incredibly closely with our partners, both the client but in the wider design team. So when we started looking at this terminal project, you can't, just look at it in isolation.
Yeah.
We looked at it holistically as an integrated series of environmental systems.
Right.
So the forest belt isn't just a backdrop to the terminal. It's working incredibly hard in terms of passive cooling around the building, and it's been proven it's dropped the temperatures a number of degrees lower.
Right.
It also acts as a filter, so a lot of the air that leaves the terminal is filtered through the canopies of those trees that sit within the forest belt. Mm-hmm. So it has a number of functions, but we also wanted the forest belt to act as a conveyance for the water that is captured on the site. So the roof water is captured. Any water that falls on the ground is also captured. There's an element that will infiltrate to feed the plants around the forest belt. But a lot of that water, particularly in heavy storm times within the monsoon season, there's a series of channels. So we created a sustainable kind of urban drainage system that conveys that water through to two very large lagoons that sit beyond the terminal within the MMTH project. So those two lagoons rise and fall, but the water in those lagoons serves the grey water demands within our terminal. So it's that water that falls, that feeds the lagoons, that is then fed back into the terminal. And that is effectively a closed loop, a closed system. So the irrigation is derived from those lagoon ponds. And it was something that we worked very early on to establish. How were we going to irrigate? We were not going to take water, potable water. Mm-hmm. We were going to use the grey water that we captured through rainfall at times of those kind of heavy monsoons. And as we know, the climate is changing in Bangalore. They have very hard flash rainfall events, and then it's relatively dry. As well as the irrigation and the system of attenuation ponds and conveyance channels, we also thought very carefully about biodiversity, both in terms of the kind of local biodiversity, but also the regional Karnataka biodiversity as well. And it became apparent in talking to the horticultural teams and the landscape teams within BIL that there was a real opportunity here to establish a planting strategy that optimized or maximized the number of native plants that we could use.
Right. And also consume less water. And
those in turn consume less water. So we were very interested in establishing, as I say, a palette of plants that would foot that bill, but also provide much broader biodiversity opportunities in terms of insect life. So our sort of challenge was to go and find those plants. Now, the horticultural industry in India, it's changing and changing very rapidly, but at the time it proved very difficult to find nurseries that were growing native trees and native herbaceous material and also native shrubs. It was, I think a lot of the nurseries were able to deliver those very common exotics and ornamentals that have become so popular within India. Right. But we really wanted to rewind that back to the idea of establishing kind of planting matrices that would not wholly replicate those of the Western and Eastern cats, but use a range of species that would begin to kind of create those types of habitats. And of course the mainstay for those areas were around the forest belt, but also extending across to the lagoon areas around the MMTH.
Which are not yet ready.
Which are not yet ready. Are those, they're very much in progress on site at the moment. Right. But the lagoons are dug and they are collecting water. So the process of that irrigation feed is already happening to T2 to reduce the amount of water usage. And that idea of setting up a sustainable water system wasn't just purely for T2, but we took that entirely through the master plan, and it's something that our client bought into very early on, and that was to create a system of capturing water across the whole master plan to ensure that they weren't reliant on anybody else's water, i.e. potable water. They could capture water off their own site for reuse, whether in grey terms for toilets or in our case for irrigation. So that was very successful. And I think that biodiversity strand has been proven very successful already. We've seen the amount of wildlife within the forest belt that's established and the number of butterfly species that have already been recorded. Yes. But as the forest belt is completed and phase 2 is brought on and we have that complete frame, that's going to be an incredible number of hectares of kind of forest that we're establishing around the terminal. So the hope is, from a sustainability point of view, that that will only increase the amount of passive shading for the terminal and for its passengers, but also in order to kind of temper the pollutants that are being generated in the air around the airport. Yeah.
This was certainly one of the most fun projects to learn about and walk around, experience it, and then find creative ways of shooting such a massive space. Like I was telling you yesterday, very rarely are the main elements that I need to photograph all the way on the ceiling, and it's a triple height ceiling, so I have the challenge of including the ground level for context and for plantings that you've done below and the hanging plants from the ceiling. So that provided a set of challenges that that we very much looked forward to, and we're glad to have been a part of this in some way. And thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you, and to talk, for you to take the time for this one conversation, it means a lot. Thank you very much.
That's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to talk today.
Well, that's our show. You can read more about this project and see more photos and videos at www.sreenagpictures.com/spotlight. You can watch full episodes and curated playlists at www.everythingcomestogether.com. Please subscribe to Sreenag Pictures on YouTube and leave a like or a comment for this video. You can listen to the audio podcast by subscribing to Everything Comes Together on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it and help get the word out about this show. The Everything Comes Together audio and video series is produced by Sreenag Pictures. Post-production by G.S. Mohan, Priyanka Rajan and Janani Balu. B-roll footage was shot by G.S. Mohan. The complete project photographs were by Sreenag Pictures. The under construction photographs were provided by Grant Associates. Original music for the theme of this series is by Aashray Harishankar from Escapist Music. Until we meet again with another fascinating guest, You can reach the show on Instagram at everything.comes.together or reach me at Sreenag. See you soon.